If anybody ever said to me, you hit like a girl, my first response would be, okay, I want to find out how hard a girl hits. Hey there, folks. Something a little bit different this time. This is actually a project that has been in the works for several months. I've been at this for a while. I want to talk about the way that female characters, women, are depicted in action scenes in movies. And more specifically, the way in which they are shown when they are in action scenes fighting against men. Now, what got my mind thinking about all this in the first place was my partner Liz and I watched a little while back the third season of Cobra Kai. I did a review of it at the time. I didn't really like the third season of Cobra Kai very much. And amongst my issues was the character of Tori, who I cannot stand. I have a lot of reasons for thinking she's a lousy character, but one of the many things I don't like about her is the fact that it is incredibly obvious that one of the primary reasons she exists as a character at all is to give Sam, Daniel LaRusso's daughter, somebody to fight whenever a big brawl breaks out, because they are always up against each other. Sam is almost never put in direct physical confrontation with a male character in anything other than a sparring scenario. That started to really bug me by the time the third season was over. I found myself wondering, is this a bigger problem? Are women not allowed to fight men in action settings? And so I started to look into it. And I found out that no, that's not really the case, but there is some odd patterns that emerged as I dug into this. All right, let's talk about my sample size and what I looked into. I decided to focus primarily on the superhero genre. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. The first is it's something I already like, so it's easier for me to go through these movies and pay attention to them than it might have been with other genres. The other thing is, while there is going to be a lot of Marvel examples, because there's a lot of Marvel movies, this is hardly going to be a single studio project. I'm going to be looking at Marvel movies, DC movies, including ones from before the current DC continuity, so I'm going to be looking at older Batman movies. I'm going to be looking at Blade. I'm going to be looking at X-Men. This is a pretty decent sample size across decades worth of movies with different directors, some men, some women, different producers, different studios behind them. So if there is an agenda by any one of these entities, that should not affect the output of the others. So I felt like this was a decent spread as far as a sampling to get an idea of the patterns in these situations. The other reason that I wanted to go with superhero genres is the fact that I would figure this would have the best shot at men and women fighting on an even playing field, because we're dealing with superpowers. You can power up a female character as much as you want, so there really isn't the usual lame-ass excuse of, well, men are just naturally stronger, what do you want? We're dealing with fantastical worlds and superpowers. That shouldn't apply here. Next up, I need to do some definitions in terms of what it was that I was looking at and noting. So I'm not doing every single superhero movie that came out in the last 20 plus years. I am zeroing in on ones that had noted female characters in action scenes. So we're going to be skipping a whole bunch of movies that did exist, but either didn't have these scenes at all, or they were such a minor part of it, it wasn't worth me going through the whole movie to find. So here's some of the things I was looking for. Were feminine characters put in confrontation with masculine characters directly at all? If so, how did that fight go? Now, the main thing that I'm looking for here, I am looking for confrontations that feel like fights between equals, an even footing battle. Now, granted, even footing, fair fight, it's a little bit subjective, especially when some superpowers come into play, because the way that they impact the fight may unbalance it one way or another, but something that to my subjective eye felt like a fair fight and was meant to be presented as two equals having it out. I also should do a clarification of what I mean by fight. My focus here is on hand-to-hand combat. No gunfights, and very little, there's going to be a couple, but very little weapon battles. Because the instant that a deadly weapon is introduced, it does change the dynamic of the fight. Because in a hand-to-hand fight, I can basically kind of compare how many times does she hit him and in what ways, and how many times does he hit her and in what ways. The minute you bring in, say, swords, whoever gets the first stab in is probably going to win. Or at the very least, a single hit is going to do a lot more damage regardless of who delivers it, simply because of the presence of weapons. As I said, there are going to be a couple of weapon fights in here, but not many. I really wanted the primary focus to be hand-to-hand. And finally, there is a term I'm going to be using a lot, so I should define that, and that is badass. But I'm not using badass as a noun, I'm using it as a verb. So when I say that a character is badassing their opponents, well, what that means is they are completely dominating them and basically taking no damage. Now, with female characters in particular, this takes one of two forms. The far more common one is that they basically do not get hit at all. They take out whoever they're against, be it one-on-one or against a group, and the female character just does not take a hit, period. The less common version of badassing is that she does take some hits, but they basically have zero impact on her. So while technically she got hit, she might as well not have. And that does come into play with some of these, because we are dealing with superheroes, some of the real OP characters. And finally, one last thing, I did not count fights that were against gender indeterminate things or monsters. So, for example, things like the Chitauri in the Avengers, whatever the hell it was Thanos bulked out his army with in Infinity War, and those weird multi-eyed whatevers that the Enchantress was controlling in Suicide Squad. If it's part of a mindless horde, or if it's a monster that I can't tell what it's meant to be, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to deal with obvious man versus woman combat. Or woman versus woman combat if that's all the movie offers. Again, we'll go over the numbers after I go through all this. Now, I gotta start running through some numbers because I watched 44 movies to go through all this, so let's get started. And let's start arbitrarily with the Thor franchise. The first Thor gives us Lady Sif, who takes on frost giants who are definitely masculine coded, and while she does take one kick over the course of that fight, I would call this pretty much a badassing the battle sort of situation. She also takes on the Destroyer, but that's a robot, so I'm not going to count it. In the sequel, Sif badasses her way through the opening battle, Frigga manages to badass Malekith, and is then restrained and taken down by the super elf. Ragnarok, Hela basically badasses everybody. From the first big fight, she has one stab that gets delivered on her, but it doesn't faze her at all. She badasses Thor, and he does get punches in, but again, they seem to have zero impact. The only thing he can hit her with is lightning, which doesn't really feel like it's part of a normal fight. It's a random new superpower, and even that didn't really do much to her.
I just hit her with the biggest lightning blast in the history of lightning. It did nothing.
Also in Ragnarok, we have Valkyrie badassing Loki. We look to the Iron Man franchise, we get the introduction of Black Widow, who just badasses her way through a one-on-one fight and then a group fight. Iron Man 3, Pepper Potts gets some powers and then badasses her way through some villains. Winter Soldier, Widow versus Bucky. Widow gets onto him, delivers some hits, and then is thrown off. Doesn't really take a punch. Over in Civil War, Widow badasses a bunch of thugs and then ultimately gets tossed away by Crossbones. Sharon and Widow take on Bucky. Both of them are tossed and then Widow is lifted and choked. Wanda badasses Vision. Widow badasses Ant-Man and then gets thrown around. Widow versus Clint is just a toss around. One throws one, then the other throws the other.
You're pulling your punches.
And just for a quick comparison, if you're thinking that's how most of the fights at the airport went, let's take a look at what was going on between Cap and Spidey. Ah! Oh! Ow! Okay, yeah, see, those are hits. The first Avengers also gave us Natasha versus Clint, and he does not land a single clean hit on her. Plus, she has that whole badassing scene as her introduction. Age of Ultron, while I would consider Ultron himself to be masculine coded, I am not counting the drones. And so that basically leaves Scarlet Witch getting one-shotted with a shock arrow. Guardians, Gamora pretty much badasses Quill, and while he does get the upper hand, it is never by outright hitting her. He never lands a punch. She does later get roughed up by Drax, but that's not really a proper fight. That's mostly a grab and a choke. She does absolutely have a proper even match with Nebula. Black Panther gives us what might be our first noted case of a fair fight between male and female characters. Now, there is badassing in the casino on the parts of Okoye and Nakia, but later on, when the Dora Milaje take on Killmonger, and then when Shuri and Nakia take on Killmonger, those are pretty evenly matched fights, although there is going to be an asterisk on that. There's actually going to be an asterisk on a number of these. We'll circle back to those at the end. The original Ant-Man I'm going to gloss over because I don't consider a sparring match to really be a proper fight, but I guess I will note that she kicks his butt. Ant-Man 2, though, when Wasp properly gets to be a superhero. She badasses her way through the restaurant goons. Now, the Ghost versus Wasp is fairly even, and Scott gets in there and even gets a good kick, but there is going to be an asterisk on that fight as well. Captain Marvel, we get what feels like a fairly even match early on, but that again is a sparring match, so that doesn't feel like it has the same weight. She later badasses her way through a Skrull ship. She takes a few hits, but they fail to slow her down even slightly. During the subway brawl, she is fighting a Skrull, but it's a Skrull that is looking like a woman. So based strictly off visuals, I'm inclined to count that as a woman versus woman fight. Later, she gets one-shotted on the Skrull ship. And later on, when her powers come on full bore, she just tears through everything and is only briefly restrained and takes a couple of hits that do not faze her at all. In other words, badassing. In Infinity War, when two of Thanos' goons come for Wanda and Vision, one male, one female, Wanda immediately breaks off to take on Proxima Midnight while Vision takes on Glaive. Now, Wanda does knock Glaive around a few times, but she only ever gets hit by Proxima. Later, Widow does badass Glaive, but that is also part of a group effort. And during that same group effort, Proxima does take hits from Falcon. Later on, Gamora takes no hits from Thanos when she stabs him, but it's fake anyway, so I'm disinclined to count it, but if I were, it would have been a badass. During the actual fight, she gets grabbed by the neck and restrained immediately. Now, most of the climax is against faceless monsters, so I'm not parsing any of that. When Nebula takes on Thanos, she does get a number of hits in, but she takes only one hit and then goes down. And later on, we have Wanda, Okoye, and Natasha taking on machines and monsters and Proxima Midnight. Interesting that the three female Avengers take on the primary female villain. Endgame, the whole team badasses Thanos. Later on, we have Nebula and Gamora badassing faceless forces. I'm disinclined to really count Widow versus Hawkeye as much of a fight, but for the record, it's one throw apiece. The Nebula showdown isn't a fight at all, it's just one shot fired. Wanda later badasses Thanos and is only stopped by a bombardment. And there is later the big Lady Avenger group thing, but that's a pretty unorganized melee, and the only real one-on-one that I caught out of that was Okoye one-shotting Glaive. And when Carol Danvers shows up to take on Thanos, she hits the heck out of him, he tosses her around, and then one-shots her. Black Widow is pretty much all women v women, Natasha versus Yelena being the big one. Now, the Taskmaster fight is a woman versus a woman, but there's also an asterisk on that one. We're going to come back to it. Shang-Chi, because I saw this in the theater, I was not able to as carefully document exactly who they were fighting against, but I did notice that out of the three primary female characters who do fight, two of them take only one hit apiece, and in both cases, that hit is an open palm to the chest. Very gentle, does not take them down. Okay, so that's the MCU, let's talk DC. Birds of Prey, as part of an opening montage, we have Harley roughing up a lady roller derby player. Huntress taking down the gangsters, takes no damage, although that is more of a gun and projectiles fight, so it's hard to quantify with how I'm doing this. Harley later gets tackled by Montoya. There's the guy with the crowbar who gets killed by the Huntress before the fight even starts. The raid on the police station has Harley just badassing her way through the entire bunch of cops. Dinah later badasses some goons in the alley, but she does take one face and one gut punch, and she does seem to notice them. They don't really slow her down at all, so I'm still counting it as a badassing, but it's a little bit more than we've seen so far. We have Harley badassing inmates. We have Harley versus a whole bunch of bikers. It's pretty much all badass. She gets grabbed once and takes two kicks to the chest and a brief choke, but yeah, those don't last long and don't impact her much. When Harley and Montoya go at it, that's a pretty evenly matched fight. During the big climax fight, Montoya gets tossed around and that's about it. Pretty much the whole crew just does a bunch of badassing. I mean, yes, by the very end, Harley looks beaten up, but that has more to do with the fact that she took a hard tumble on concrete. Suicide Squad, Harley gets one-shotted by Batman. Enchantress versus the group is interesting because she takes more hits than I remembered her taking, including a flat-out punch to the head from Deadshot, so okay. The entire group still isn't really able to slow her down much, but that shot was interesting to catch. And of course, later on, it's Harley who gets to rip out her heart. Wonder Woman, during the invasion of Themyscira, the Amazons only go down from gunfire, but in the hand-to-hand, I did not see a single Amazon take a single hit. The alley fight, no hits taken. No Man's Land and the dash to town afterwards, no hits taken. Diana assaults the base, no hits taken. She's just badassing her way through this. Although when she takes up the roided up Ludendorff, there is a brief but pretty legitimate brawl with not only throws, but also body hits. The confrontation with Ares is a lot of zapping magic nonsense around. And when they briefly go hand to hand, it's basically just a lot of throws. Wonder Woman 1984, she badasses her way through the mall fight. Barbara later gets to badass a guy in the street. Diana does start getting slowed down later, but it's interesting that it's from bullets. And that would include the convoy chase and the White House battle. And both times Diana takes on Barbara, it is a pretty legit brawl. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Wonder Woman only really fights a monster. Granted, it is based off a masculine character, so I suppose we could count it. She gets a car thrown at her. She blocks pretty much everything thrown at her with the shield. She does take one punch, but the shot where we see it is from quite a distance. Justice League theatrical version. Wonder Woman versus the terrorists, she just completely badasses them. Amazon versus Steppenwolf. The parademons are largely shooting lasers, so there isn't nearly as much hand-to-hand as you would expect. Now, Steppenwolf is swinging an axe around, but in the theatrical, we don't see a lot of those hits land. We just see him swinging and people flying around, but we don't actually see the hits. Later on, he does get a direct hit on Amazon on horseback, but otherwise he's largely slamming the ground, sending out shockwaves, and tossing people around. The big flashback is, frankly, it's too much chaos. I can't even with that thing. Later on, Steppenwolf throws Mara around. The first time the League takes on Steppenwolf, Wonder Woman blocks everything with the shield and just gets tossed about a bit. When Superman takes on the Justice League, Wonder Woman makes use of the lasso, but does get grabbed and thrown, and there's a quick back and forth of headbutting, but she goes down from that. The big climax fight, so far as I was able to tell, every single hit directed at Wonder Woman is blocked by the shield or the bracers. She does sometimes get knocked back from the force of that, but she blocks them. Because I know some people who will ask, quick comparison to the Snyder Cut. While there are some minor differences, for my purposes, Wonder Woman versus the Terrorists is basically the exact same thing. It is interesting that Steppenwolf versus the Amazon has him take down a lot more and we see the hits more. And it is worth noting that pretty much every time Steppenwolf goes to attack someone, he one-shots them and they're gone. Similar to last time, Mara gets pinned to the wall by the neck and thrown. First time Steppenwolf takes on Wonder Woman, it's effectively the same as the theatrical, at least for my purposes. Ditto for the League versus Superman and Steppenwolf versus the League in the climax. Again, there are differences, but for the things I'm looking for, it's effectively the same fight. Aquaman: Atlanta badasses the Atlantis troops in the opening. Mara later badasses the Atlantean Guard. The only reason she has to flee is because they have guns. She does get grabbed by the neck at one point, but she tears off the guy's helmet and that takes care of that. And she gets to badass a few guys during the big climax, but largely doesn't get involved in the fight. Let's hop on over to the X-Men franchise. First X-Men movie, Mystique badasses the Senator. Sabretooth chokelifts Storm. She then bolts him. Wolverine versus Mystique. It's interesting that for most of that fight, she looks like him. And during the periods where she looks like herself, she actually doesn't really ever take a proper hit. Toad takes on both Jean and Storm, and that's mostly made up of tossing them around. He does deliver 2 kicks to Storm, who gets no hits in on him initially, although she does zap the hell out of him later. X2, during the assault on the school, all the female students either get tranquilized or just run. We get to see Mystique badass a small group of guards, taking no hits. Jean dealing with a mind-controlled Scott is just tossing him around. Wolverine versus Lady Deathstrike, pretty evenly matched because, well, they have the same power set, and that is, again, going to be a little bit of an asterisk. We will come back to it. X-Men: The Last Stand. Mystique gets to badass more guards in the interrogation room. Presumably she does get restrained after that, but we don't see that. We just see her taking them on. And while Jean is a major threat by the nature of her powers, she is mostly either tossing people around or just dissolving them. Later on we have Storm one-shotting Quill. I'm going to count that as a badass. When Wolverine assaults Magneto's camp, it's pretty much all dudes. During the melee portions of the Alcatraz fight, I only saw dudes, while the Lady Speedster is paired off against Storm. Kitty Pryde takes no hits, but that's also kind of her entire skill set. X-Men First Class. White Queen tosses Magneto off the boat with one shot. Later on, Emma Frost is restrained by Magneto and Xavier. It isn't really a proper fight. And Angel versus Banshee and then Havoc ending it is a power throw around. Not really what I'm looking for. Days of Future Past. Mystique gets to badass a room of soldiers again, as well as all the people in the Trask conference room. She also shoots and kicks around Magneto a bit. This movie has an odd fixation with having female characters get stabbed in the back without really having much of a fight. It happens to Storm and to Blink twice. X-Men Apocalypse, most of the action scenes in this are just CGI power slinging, which is probably why this movie is so boring, or at least part of it. There is Psylocke versus Beast, and literally nobody lands a hit on anybody until she throws him into a wall. After that, she does get a legitimate kick in the head and thrown, but Kurt bamfs Beast out of the fight before we can really get a sense of how evenly matched they are. And of course, Mystique gets choked out by Apocalypse. Dark Phoenix, again, by the nature of her powers, Jean is mostly just telekinetically throwing people around, including the fatal tossing of Mystique into some sharp wood. We do have a female character tossed out of a train. I'm going to count that as a one-shot, as well as an unnamed female villain who gets bamfed out onto the train tracks. Bryce Dallas Howard's character, Vuck, I think is her name. She basically just badasses and takes every hit, and it does not appear to slow her down up until she takes on Jean, and then it's just a CGI mess. New Mutants. Really, the only thing that isn't a fight against some kind of monster is Rain doing a quick mall job on the dock. Deadpool. He tosses around two unnamed women during the montage as he hunts for Francis. It does kind of get lampshaded, this whole question that I'm addressing.
It's just confusing. Is it sexist to hit you? Is it more sexist to not hit you? I mean, the line gets real blurry.
We have the villain character of Angel Dust, who initially one-shots Colossus. She then takes a hit from Negasonic Teenage Warhead, but they don't really have a proper fight. She gets the one hit from her, and then it's back to her and Colossus, which is a pretty legitimate brawl. Initially, Colossus's hits don't seem to be doing much to her, but by the time the fight is wrapping up, yeah, no, that is a full-on battle between them. Deadpool 2, again, kind of the nature of the beast with her powers. Domino, taking on the convoy, basically takes no hits. When she takes on Cable, she gets hits in, and then he chokeslams her. She later gets to badass some orderlies. Towards the end, Yukio and Negasonic do show up to take on Juggernaut, but they basically just deploy their powers one time each and he's done. So I'd consider that a badass. Logan. Laura completely badasses the soldiers. She is only briefly restrained by a harpoon, and because of her healing factor, it does very little to slow her down. She gets to badass in the forest again later, and even pretty thoroughly badasses X-24 until he throws and gives her a single backhand, which I'm going to count as a one-shot, because she doesn't get involved in the fight after that. Well, she does, but it's with a gun. Let's take a quick rundown of some Batman movies. Batman Returns. Catwoman badasses some punks in the alley. She disarms and spooks the guards. I'm going to count it as a badassing. Her first fight with Batman, she just wails on him until he gets in one backhand and then one more shot later, which basically one-shots her off the roof. So she hits him a lot, he hits her twice and fight's over. Batman and Robin. Ivy really only gets into a proper fight against Batgirl, and Batgirl is briefly grabbed and choked by Bane, but that's not really a fight. The Dark Knight Rises. Selina gets to badass guys in a bar, and later the finance guy and his bodyguards. Catwoman. When she first shows up in the bar, nobody even throws a punch at her. When she interrupts the robbery, she just completely badasses the three robbers. She has a relatively even fight against Sharon Stone at the very end. And let's round it out with the Blade movies. During the iconic first action scene, Blade just one-shots a bunch of vamps, which does include two women. Later on, a young vampire catches Blade off guard and gets in several kicks before going down on a single backhand to the head. There is a female vampire as part of a duo taking on Blade hand to hand. She gets in a couple completely ineffective hits before getting knocked down and blowed up. Karen knocks around a zombie, which granted is more down and dirty than the usual badassing, but he doesn't get any hits in on her. Later on, Karen takes on a female vampire who chokes her and gives her a punch before Karen maces her. Blade's mom never lands a hit on him during their brief confrontation. He chokes her and then stakes her. Blade 2, pretty even sword fight between Blade and Nyssa. However, there is going to be an asterisk on this one. We're lumping it together at the end. We'll come back to it. Later on, when she runs into Novak, he simply restrains her. There isn't really a fight between them. Blade Trinity, Abigail badasses her way through pretty much everything. She does technically take a couple of hits in her introductory scene, but that is when she's faking helplessness. So she badasses the guys in the subway, badasses during the police escape, badasses security at the doctor's office, badasses a bunch of guards, later takes on three vampires, badasses them. She gets briefly grabbed from behind, but that doesn't last long. And it is worth noting that during the climax, while she's badassing and not taking a single hit, the other two male characters have parallel brawls going on where they are both taking some notable hits. And towards the very end, Danica takes on Hannibal, but it's interesting that we never really see a hit in that one. We see people being tossed around. We see that she's clearly gotten the better of Hannibal, but we don't really see the fight. Okay, so let's start actually dissecting what I've thrown at you. Now, in case some of you are wondering, well, isn't the badassing, the hitting a bunch of people and not taking any hits yourself, isn't that standard for an action hero? Isn't that the case with a lot of male heroes? Well, sometimes, but usually by the climactic fight, they are going to take hits. There was a reason that a couple of points along this road, I did quick comparison to the male fights going on in the same movies as these movies where the female characters are only being badasses. And it's the way in which these fights are handled differently that I kind of want to zero in on. Let's get into some specifics as far as numbers go. So out of the 44 movies that I watched, 16 of them had women fighting women. And out of those 16, 12 of them I considered to be even matches. So when women fought women about 3/4 of the time, that was an even fight. Out of those 44 movies, 39 had women fighting men. However, only 8 of those fights I considered to be even. That is 21%. 21% versus 75%. And for the record, when women fought men, be it one-on-one or in a group, 85% of the time, the women got to just badass them. You may have also noticed some recurring trends and phrases when I talked about the ways in which these fights went. In 21% of these movies, we had female characters getting one-shotted, i.e. taking a single hit, then going down regardless of how the fight went prior to that. 29% had the major damage done to female characters being they get thrown, and 39% featured either a chokehold or some kind of restraint, but otherwise not a punch. So what is it that we're actually seeing here? Well, my original suspicion after watching Cobra Kai Season 3 that women would only be paired off against women and not allowed to fight guys at all, that definitely did not turn out to be true. The vast majority of these had women fighting men. But, as noted, it's not on even footing. Somebody is completely outmatching the other. Either the female character completely outmatches the masculine characters and just badasses them, usually through never getting hit. And if a female character does take quote-unquote hits, it's pretty common for it to be a throw, a choke, something that isn't just a punch. And even when punches happen, there are odd things that make it a little bit weird and a little bit out of place. I've mentioned things like them happening way in the distance in the background. Or there's things like the sparring match in Captain Marvel where it opens with her getting punched in the face, but we don't see the punch, we see the result of it.
You slipped as a result of me punching you in the face.
I was already slipping when you happened to punch me in the face. The two events are not related.
She takes one other punch later in that sparring match, but the sound design makes it sound like a super soft hit. By and large, when women get a legitimate punch, that's the end of the fight for them. They go down. Now again, this was part of why I wanted to look at superheroes. I thought that would be a way to avoid this because it feels like everything is built around this idea that women hit faster but cannot take a punch. It's like they're working off 1980s and 90s arcade brawler rules. The female character is always faster but cannot take nearly as much damage. Now, even with some of those more or less even fights, there's some asterisks I mentioned. Let's deal with those. Now, there's sort of a cluster of ones where it is technically a male versus female fight or a female versus female fight, but because of the costume design, the nature of the gender is obscured. So this applies to, say, the first time Ghost fights Wasp and Ant-Man. Now, that is technically, during the parts where she is fighting Scott, a woman versus man fight, but she has not been established as a woman yet. Similarly with Blade 2, when Nyssa and Blade face off. Now, in both those cases, if you are paying careful attention to the costume design, you might notice a more feminine build, but the odds of you spotting that your first time watching aren't great. And it's the same but in the other direction with Taskmaster in Black Widow. The first time that Taskmaster takes on Black Widow, that's a pretty legit brawl, and Taskmaster is designed in a way to look like possibly a man. And if you manage to avoid all the online speculation about who Taskmaster would be, which pretty much everybody who was speculating about it assumed it was gonna be a woman. But if you didn't know that, you could think she's taking on a man, but by the time the movie's over, no, that wasn't the case. So it's an even footing fight that looks like a woman versus man, possibly, but in fact is not. Then there's some things that I marked as fair fights that still need some kind of asterisk. I mentioned this in the Black Panther. So I mentioned the Dora Milaje taking on Killmonger, and then later Shuri and Nakia taking on Killmonger. Now, in both these cases, I would call them pretty evenly matched. However, it is worth noting that it is one guy versus multiple women, and the guy wins. Now, that is affected somewhat by the technology. Having the Black Panther suit does tip the balance significantly, but I still feel like that's worth mentioning. And honestly, the kind of group scenarios get weird and fuzzy in the first place. Similarly with the Enchantress versus Suicide Squad. I was surprised to see a punch to the head delivered to her and to see it clearly, but she is still outmatching an entire group. And then you have things like the fights in X2 or with Laura and Logan where, yeah, they take a few hits, but they've also got a healing factor, which really feels like it evens the playing field. But even that taken into consideration, in Logan, Laura never really gets a direct hit. She gets speared once and one-shotted by X-24. Now, the Lady Deathstrike versus Wolverine fight in X2, that's pretty legit. Initially, she's more or less badassing him, and she definitely gets in more shots than he does, but he does get some legit shots in on her. But again, they both have healing factors, so it almost feels like, well, they can do whatever they want. Honestly, out of the very few even footing male versus female fights that I found in these 44 films, there were only 2 that I would call clean matchups that I do not feel the need to add asterisks onto. One was the first Wonder Woman when she takes on the General, because while brief, that is actually a pretty evenly matched fight and he does legit hit her. The other one being Deadpool, Angel Dust, and Colossus. By the end, yeah, that is a proper brawl. So, what are we looking at here? We're looking at a situation where there is a pretty decent amount of female action heroes out there. But even in a genre where they should be able to, at least some of them, be powered up to the point to just have a flat out even match, the presumption is still there that they go down with a single punch. And there is a reluctance to show a man punching a woman. Thus, we have the throws and the chokes. It's a way for a masculine character to assert a dominance in the fight without having to actually punch a woman.
How could you? I'm a woman.
So we're now living at a time when there are more female action heroes than ever before, but they seem to have a lot of really strict prescriptions on how they are allowed to be action heroes. They have to be ninjas. They rarely take a hit. If they take a hit, it hurts them a lot more than the hits that they are delivering against men. Now, how much of this is a built-in assumption that women are just weaker and will not take hits as well, again, despite superpowers being in play, or whether it's some misguided sense of chivalry where people just aren't comfortable seeing a man punch a woman? There is cultural baggage. It's a thing. And like every time I talk about tropes and patterns, this is not deliberate. There's no Machiavellian counsel going, we cannot let women be shown to be fighting on even footing with men, especially can't show that they can take damage as well as dish it out. No! That's not happening. But the pattern's still there. And it's odd to me because male action heroes can be a lot of things. They can be brawlers. They can be martial artists. They can be clumsy fighters. They can be elegant fighters. They can be drunken masters. But most of all, they can take a hit and keep going. It is one of the traits we really ascribe to masculine heroes. Heck, it was the entire basis of the Rocky franchise.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done.
Take the hit and keep moving. But when it's a woman fighting, don't get hit at all. Because if you do, you won't get back up. If we were to step outside of the superhero genre, are there any notable exceptions? My friends, Charlize Theron has entered the arena. Mad Max Fury Road, The Old Guard, and holy crap, Atomic Blonde. When Charlize Theron goes into a fight against a guy, this is going to be an even footing, blow for blow fight. And while pretty much all of those are more serious-minded, it can happen in sillier things. I noticed it in Gunpowder Milkshake. The women got hit quite a bit. Heck, if you want to go further back, the first Mortal Kombat movie when Kano took on Sonya Blade. He got to legit kick her in the gut, and then she killed him. And while the exceptions are wonderful, the fact that they're exceptions is still weird to me. And again, especially in something like the superhero genre, where powers should even all this out. Even with the biggest action genre that is dealing with more and more and more female action heroines every time a new movie comes out, they're still treated with kid gloves. Oh, they can dish it out. Oh, they can take you down. But they cannot stand up to punishment. And when they get hit, if it doesn't take them out, usually it's because it has literally zero impact on them or is in some way deliberately softened. Be it through sound design, the hit being open palm instead of a closed fist, or more often, they get thrown or choked. But they don't get to fight the way men get to fight. Kind of a shame. I think something that maybe would be a good thing to work on doing away with. Again, especially in superheroes. So there you go, folks. That's my findings and my thoughts on how women are depicted in action scenes in movies. Focusing on the superhero genre, but I expect if you were to subdivide this into other genres, you'll probably have similar findings. Anyone who wants to do that work, feel free to reach out, but I'm done. I've been working on this forever. What do you think about all this? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, and subscribe. I got a Patreon. That is how I pay my bills. It's how this whole operation stays up and running. Any amount you're able to support me does help me greatly. You'll notice I don't really get sponsors for this channel. I'm open to them. I am for sale, but this exists because of your help. But if you're not able to, that is also okay. I'm not going to tell you what to do, because at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned. Hey, if you're sticking around through the credits, might as well hear some names read out. My Patreon helps support this, and in particular, I want to thank Raven McBain, Bookworm, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edalyn, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, and Shayla Gourlay. Want to hear me mispronounce your name? Check out the rewards on the Patreon.